Oh yes, the scuba diving.
The scuba diving. And apparently it's the place to do it down there, isn't it?
Oh, we've got the coastline.
Because is it the mountains are sort of inverted and you've got all these...
Well, we've got the deep water where you can sort of swim over mountains and all sorts of things.
So John William Cooper was born on the 3rd of September 1944, and we come to know him publicly because he was eventually convicted of 4 murders, 1 rape, 1 sexual assault and 30 burglaries, plus 1 attempted robbery. So we know in his early life, when he was aged between about 17 and 21, he already had a criminal record and he was charged with vehicle theft, assaulted a police officer, drunken disorderly, and also actual bodily harm. It's nice that he had so little respect for people and for the hard work people put into getting their properties and the items which he ultimately wanted and he could have had out of his winnings, but chose to throw it down his throat really and into the bookmakers. That he was caught by a lady whose house he was robbing, and he did injure her, but during this particular robbery she managed to raise the alarm and he ran off and he discarded his, I think it was gloves or his balaclava. And so in 1998 he was charged for these robberies, and that was during what was known as Operation Huntsman. So during Operation Huntsman, once they'd arrested and charged him, they decided that it would be good to do the ballistics testing, because he had a shotgun, sawn-off shotgun with him on these robberies, and they dug about his house and they found lots of things buried, lots of different keys, clothing, strange items really that he would have stolen from people's houses. And for want of a better word, he was keeping them as trophies. So he did go to prison, and that was a happy event. But if we wander back to 1985, there was a double murder at Scoveston Manor Park. So the 2 people that lived there at the time were Richard Thomas, he was aged 58, and his sister Helen Thomas, who was aged 55, also lived with him. Now, in their own right, these were wealthy people. They managed land, they owned land, and the house that they lived in was huge. It was really nice, what you would expect of country gentry, really, who work in the agriculture industry. So one night, Scoveston Park goes up in flames, and fire brigade's called. When they go in, they find that Helen is on a bed face down, and because of the fire, that's fallen through to the first floor and through onto the ground floor. And at the top of the stairs is Richard, dead on the landing. So the initial thought was that this was a murder-suicide. There had been rumours that the siblings were having a bit of friction between themselves. And maybe she wanted to sell all of the land and he didn't. But it became quite clear really through the autopsy that the injuries that they both had, they were impossible to have been self-inflicted anyway. And they both died of gunshot injuries. So, being in a fairly small town, it's natural that rumours would go round that village. And one of the local rumours was that Richard had got himself involved a little bit above his head in terms of an oil project. So Gulf Oil Refinery were wanting to build a railway line, and this all started in the 1960s, 1965. The project itself would have involved providing 280 jobs, and it would have provided a lot of traffic through the local villages. So whilst a lot of landowners were quite happy to rent out their bits of land for construction companies to have an operational base, Richard was totally opposed to this. So where they wanted to put the railway line through was about 250 metres from Scoveston, and he refused point blank. So even when a compulsory purchase order was provided, so a legal act, he still wouldn't have any of it. And he put a lot of obstruction in their place, raised so many objections, appeals. He wouldn't even let them onto his land to do the surveys. So it caused the project massive setbacks. It caused huge problems. And of course, British Rail were wanting to take over the railway. And it didn't actually get resolved until Richard died. So in 1985, December 22nd, when Richard and Helen were murdered, British Rail still did not own or have the contract completed for the railway, which was going to support the refinery. So probably a bit of a coincidence, but it is one of the local rumours. The other rumour was that Richard was a homosexual and that he'd got into some sort of situation with a bloke, and the bloke had murdered him, or Richard had murdered his sister because she found out, and then the bloke murdered him. In any event, this was all nonsense. None of that happened at all. It was John Cooper. But the first suspect in the frame was linked a little bit to the homosexual theory. So William, or Billy Jones, was a very, very troubled man. He was born in 1958, and at 18 his parents could not have him at home anymore. He did have an alcohol problem. This caused him to be violent regularly, and he became very obsessed with religion. So he used to sit in the window of his parents' house shouting at people walking by, delivering sermons, and then he'd get drunk or just gradually more and more aggressive, and it would turn into less of a sermon about religion and more of an abusive tirade at people, and they couldn't cope with it. So they kicked him out, and so he spent most of his adult life just travelling end to end of the UK, and he looked a little bit like a down and out, or was described as a down and out, but he was able to change his appearance so often and so well that he could look very, very clean cut, very clean, and then maybe the next time we saw him or a few weeks later he could look extremely unkempt. So he was a bit of a chameleon. He did hold criminal records himself for criminal damage and actual bodily harm, and he was charged in Birkenhead by Liverpool, Lincoln, Bury and Taunton Deane. Because of his religious fanaticism, he did call on priests a lot, and he would ask them to pray with him, and he'd tell them that he needed them to exorcise Satan from his body, that he'd been possessed and he needed this religious help. He also became very obsessed with a vessel, so a big ship that had been turned into a religious library, and that was called the MV Logos. And he'd give that as his address sometimes, so he didn't have a fixed abode, and he would become aggressive when he was trying to claim his benefits at the DHSS, and he would become very unreasonable in social situations. So he would go around and try and drink people's pints. If he was at a pub, he'd try and steal their bar snacks, and it would always end in him having a physical altercation with them. So what we do know is that on the 21st and 22nd of December 1985, Billy was in Milford Haven, which is where Scoverton Manor Park is, and he was positively identified as being at the end of the lane to Scoverston, about 5:15 to 5:30, which was less than 4 hours before Helen Thomas's last conversation was had. I have been to Scoverton Park Manor as it is now, and I can tell you that it's obviously under new ownership. It's not the easiest place to find. A lot of rebuilding work has been done surrounding it, and originally I thought it had been turned into a B&B, so I was hoping to stay there, but as it turns out that's not the case, so I just ended up bothering I think the the current owners, but they were really, really nice. But I can tell you that the road that leads down to it is really, really long, so it's quite... I don't know where this person would have seen anybody standing, because once you get down the dirt track which takes you into the residential area, there's not really... well, there certainly isn't now a lot of reason to be there. I would imagine that it would have been questioned. But nonetheless, you would stick out, I suppose, like a sore thumb if you were seen in that area at that particular time. Naturally, the police followed up on that, and he was a person of interest. He was sectioned in 1986 to Shelton Mental Hospital. And when he was questioned by the police within that establishment, he reacted in such a manner that the psychologist who was working with him and a doctor told the police that he was likely responsible for the Thomas's killing. He died in 2014, and I can't find any records as to how he was cleared from the police inquiry, but ultimately that must be the case, and ultimately we know that it was John Cooper who was charged and incarcerated for the crime. Cooper's next victims that we know of were Peter and Gwenda Dixon. They were on holiday in Pembrokeshire from their hometown of Witney in Oxfordshire, and the first case that we spoke about, the Scotstoun Manor, was in Milford Haven. What we're about to speak of was near Little Haven. So if you were to drive the whole area of this, it would probably take you less than an hour. It was when I did it and went to visit some of the sites. By all accounts, in the 1980s, when you went camping, it was because it was a very cheap holiday for people to go on. So the glamping experience that you would get now, or posh caravans and motorhomes, just wasn't really the thing to do. If you're an outdoorsy person, you really did live with the basics for however long that you were there. So if you went to a campsite, you would have communal showers, not always hot running water, very often no electricity and amenities, and you did everything on a gas cooking stove. A tent you would buy now, which would be boasting features of keeping you warm up to -3, or posh sleeping bags. It just wasn't the done thing. You just took some warm clothes, took waterproofs, and off you went. And the idea being you weren't going to be spending too much time in your tent unless it was raining. People did like to just go and walk in those days. And the best place to do it really is Wales. They have got over 100 miles of beautiful, beautiful coastline. And that's really what the Dixons were doing. That was the whole purpose, to just go and de-stress. From accounts in the papers, they were quite active people. Gwenda was a badminton player and Peter enjoyed running. So it was an ideal holiday destination for them, where you can literally just wander for miles and miles and miles, and it's quite undisrupted now, so I would imagine it was even more rural in the 1980s. So the footage that you see in now is the drive back to the campsite, so it was about a minute's drive. You can see that it's obviously become a little more modernised now with big static caravans. That's one entrance into the campsite. That might have been the one that they left, because it was only 600 yards away to the entrance to the Costal Path, which is going to be the next bit of footage that you'll see in a moment. But it's such a gorgeous area. You can see on the right there just how many caravans this site now actually has, and it's not renamed itself. But they didn't do anything wrong, so they didn't have to, did they? It's not rebranded. And this is where they left on the morning that they went for a final walk on the Coastal Path, and then unfortunately met with John Cooper and ended up dead in quite a brutal fashion. So it's not an unpopular spot still. I was losing light, which is why it's fairly quiet, but that's the main entrance into the campsite there. And it's a beautiful spot of the world, it really is. So I believe just on the left there is the footpath they may have taken. They would probably have come from the opposite direction to how I'm entering it. It's not advisable, obviously, to go wandering off on your own, A, on a bit of a cliff edge, and B, in a secluded area like this. I think it was like 10 minutes to go until the sun set. I can't say that it felt very unnerving or, eerie or awful or anything like that, which I did sort of expect to get a sense of, considering I was retracing the steps and to some extent of people who've been murdered on this very path. Something that I did think about was just how many places there are for somebody to hide and just jump out on you, which is a bit of an eerie thought. And ultimately that's what happened to Peter and Gwenda as they were walking down the path, and it would have been much further on. I don't know if they went left or right or which way, but just even looking at the scenery there, you can see why it's such a hot spot for walkers. Without any warning, we think John Cooper had jumped out from the brush, and you can see so many places you could lay down and just sit and wait for somebody, which is, I think, what he did. Before he killed Peter and Gwenda, he tied them both up, tied their hands behind the back. He got the bank card from Peter, and then he shot them both. We know he did some dreadful things to Gwenda also, and ultimately they didn't return home the same day. Their son, who was 22 at the time, reported them missing to the police after 4 days, and their bodies were found within 6 days. Of course, quite a task for the police at that time. You're next to the sea, there's elements. It was in June, so you have the summer heat as well. The bodies wouldn't have been in a particularly nice state, and Peter's body was actually on the edge of the cliff, so recovering the two bodies was quite a difficult task. The other key point to this is that the manner in which they'd been murdered, so both had had their hands tied behind the back, both had been executed at point blank range with a shotgun. It did look like a professional hit, and at the time there was a terrorist group, the IRA, which England was having trouble with and had got involved with in terms of trying to shut down. And nearby was a drop of lots of weapons and items associated with terrorism. Because he'd taken the bank card and forced the pin out of Peter, he was then able to go and withdraw cash, which really negated the terrorism theory because there was activity on Peter's account after he'd died. So the police were able to say that in fact it had been a robbery and a double murder and nothing to do with external forces. Other than that, thousands of police officers were deployed to look into this particular crime, and because he had gone into the town to use the NatWest Bank, there were people who did see him, and they were able to provide quite a good police artist impression of the person who'd withdrawn that money. Within that artist impression, they also captured a pair of short khaki shorts which the perpetrator was wearing, and these factors would come back to bite John Cooper later on, and we will get to that. So the footage that you're seeing now is on the Mount Estate, which is back in Milford Haven. So in 1996, that's 11 years after he'd murdered the Thomases and 7 years after he'd murdered the Dixons, John Cooper struck again, and this time he decided to terrorise a group of 5 teenagers. Now, 2 of those teenagers were boys, and they've never quite recovered from what he did to them on that field that day. And out of the 3 girls that were there, unfortunately, one's lost her life, not through him doing anything to her directly, and the other two girls which he attacked, absolutely phenomenal in terms of coming forward and actually giving evidence at his trial. There's not a lot online that I could find in relation to what exactly went on in that field. Needless to say, it was a horrific attack on the females, and again, he just walked away for quite a few years until he was brought to justice. But the evidence from the 2 ladies now were absolutely vital in getting him incarcerated and being part of that golden thread of evidence from right the way back in 1985 for the murders in 1989, and they were able to bear witness to him for their attack in 1996. So bear in mind, if we go right back to the beginning, that John Cooper had been incarcerated for all of the burglaries. He was now becoming due for release. And during this time, this new operation had been going through the cold case evidence and had managed to tie it all together. So what you're looking at now, I believe, is the field where the attack happened. I can't be 100% certain of it, but I think that's where it is. And what I find really, really bizarre is, I mean, you can see from the video, it's just such a quiet estate. It looks like anywhere in England. It looks so peaceful. It's just not something that you would expect to happen. Clearly 5 teenagers went out doing what teenagers do, going out having a gossip and a chat and hanging out together, and then that happens. It's just incredulous. On this occasion, we can say that the police did an absolutely outstanding job of not only collecting evidence thoroughly, but preserving it, to the point where years later the new investigation was able to retest thousands of items, looking for DNA, looking for any tie which would match John Cooper to the 3 crimes that we've just discussed. John was brought out of prison on day releases to speak with the officers of the new investigation and be interviewed about the events, ever fearful that this man was about to be re-released from prison and really needing to get him straight back in and charged with these particular offences. And of course, John can't take any responsibility for himself and went so far as to say that actually the shorts that they were looking at were clothes that his son had stolen. His son is a thief. His son cannot be trusted under any circumstance. The police were, however, able to tie the keys that were found in John Cooper's house to Scoverson Manor Park. These were some of the items that were recovered from under the house that you're looking at. They also found his shotgun, which he protected in a cylindrical cardboard tube. The paint on the gun was matched to paint found at his house, and the gun was identical from descriptions, as well as his gloves. The shorts, which had become central to the case, were shorts that he'd taken from Gwenda Dixon, and it was only by unpicking the hem, because they'd been taken up further, did they find the tiniest drop of Peter Dixon's blood. One problem in getting a firm identification was that John Cooper said that he didn't have any photographs of himself around the time of the murders, so it was quite difficult, in fact, to be able to get a firm identification of him. But as luck would have it, he'd been on television around that time, playing darts in Bullseye, and this was around the same time that the police had done the artist impression of the person who was at the NatWest Bank accessing Peter Dixon's bank account with his own bank card, and the resemblance was quite striking, which was good, but unfortunate for John Cooper. Our final location is Spring Gardens, so this is the street that he lived on, and this was where the police held a large search. Looking at it, same as every other road, not too dissimilar from the Mount Estate that we already saw, and it's quite scary actually to think that these people who do these absolutely awful, terrifying things are no different to your neighbours. You wouldn't look at him and see anything other than a bit of a dishevelled, angry little man, but his neighbours never suspected anything of it. I don't know if his family did. In my unprofessional opinion, to me, John Cooper is just a pathetic little man that never actually achieved anything in his life, and I think it's possible that he knew he was unable to achieve anything on his own. He wasn't able to achieve financial success. He had to gamble. He wasn't able to keep hold of that success or do anything positive with it because he spent it all. He wasn't able to maintain a positive relationship with his family. The fact he has to blame his son for things that he has done. He clearly has control issues, in my opinion. The fact he has to take trophies, regain that feeling if he wants to go and hold them or see them, something that he's done, possibly the only thing that he's ever felt proud of or in control about. It's also a furthering sense of terror for the victims who've lived, that he could actually come back one day, whether it's because he's got his house keys, maybe he's got a bank card, he has their address. To take somebody's clothes is indicative to me of a trophy mentality. Thankfully, he's now been incarcerated for life. He continues to take absolutely no responsibility for his actions. He believes that he's been fitted up and framed, but ultimately he has no defence. He has no way of saying that he has not done these things other than blaming other people when the evidence clearly suggests something totally different. So what I prefer to be able to do is actually go and find the graves of the people who have been murdered and honour them in that way. However, I've been unable to on this occasion. So what I have done is I've planted a flower, a nice bright blue flower and a nice bright pink flower for Richard Thomas, Helen Thomas, Peter Dixon and Gwenda Dixon.